Good morning, everybody. We're going to get rolling. Welcome to AKAM's educational webinar series on navigating the 2026 budget season with a focus on recent statutory changes and how SIRS and non-SIRS requirements may impact and need to be included within your 2026 budget. My name is Alex Argento, and I'm the Senior Vice President and Head of Southeast Operations for AKAM, and I am pleased to have with me today for our program, Maureen Reyes, Vice President of Business Development at AKAM, and Matt Quisley, Regional Executive Director at Reserve Advisors. Good morning to you both. Thank you for being here today. Before we jump in, to those of you participating today, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar to submit questions, and we'll do our best to answer them along the way during the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and we will upload it to the AKAM website in the next week. So if you missed something, wanted to rewatch, or share with other stakeholders within your community, you'll be able to do so. So with the housekeeping matters out of the way, welcome everyone to this AKAM educational presentation, and let's get started. Matt, good morning. Tremendous to talk about, emotionally charged. How are we going to do this?
We're going to do it together, Alex. I think that's the key, and I think that there is a lot that the legislature over the last 4 years has thrown at our condo association boards, and some challenges that certainly are there to face, and some new stuff that just got passed into law, House Bill 913. That will kind of be the focus of this presentation. So just at a high level, this is going to focus heavily on condominium associations. I think some of the concepts, if you're an HOA or a cooperative, cooperatives have some very similar to condo, but if you're an HOA, the laws aren't necessarily going to apply to you, but I think the concepts will very much. Of course, you're in the same situation of budget season and maintaining property, but the requirements are going to be different. Can you guys see my screen okay? I'm going to switch over. Yeah, quick title slide of everyone here. For myself, I'm a professional engineer, been doing reserve studies with Reserve Advisors for more than 25 years now. Been very involved with the Florida Legislative Alliance, which is CAI's Legislative Action Committee, over the last 4 years, ever since the tragedy in Champlain Tower South that prompted the legislature to take action to require the milestone inspections and the SIRS, Structural Integrity Reserve Study. You'll hear us say SIRS a whole bunch. If we said Structural Integrity Reserve Study, we'd go over time. So we're going to shorten it to SIRS and hopefully answer all your questions. And thank you, Maureen and Alex, for both joining me today as well. My background is civil and environmental engineering, but again, very, very involved with the reserve study specifically. And I'm also a condominium board member. So like many of you in the audience today, I attend those meetings in the evening, and I'm on my non-work time and do my best to navigate these. I'm in a condominium where we have mix of 3-story and 2-story buildings, relatively small association, but we're dealing with kind of the same issues here where I live, where I'm sitting today, actually in that condo association, where these impact us as well, and is something that I think, obviously being in the industry, we have a lot of understanding of and are in good shape, like many of you, I'm sure, and have done due diligence up until this point. So now we just need to make sure we're checking all the boxes and getting through these new requirements as well. Maureen, Alex, did you want to say anything else about your backgrounds, or should we just jump right in?
Let's jump in.
Yes, a lot to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna cover the SIRS overview, including the 913 changes, just to bring everyone up to speed. And some of you are probably new board members and haven't been involved with this year in and year out. This is actually like the 4th version of the condo laws that have taken place post Surfside. And so we'll cover all of that. We're going to spend some time talking about reporting requirements and disclosures, which have become more important than ever now that the deadlines are passing or approaching for conducting the SIRS. We're going to talk about incorporating into our 2026 budget. We're probably all in the midst of starting to look at draft budgets and getting ready for what this means, and again, navigating those impacts. We'll talk a little bit about funding strategies and completion of the SIRS, as well, as we get a lot of questions on that material throughout my experience. And we work with thousands of homeowners, condos and homeowners associations throughout the state of Florida. We've done about 1,000. Our firm's done a little over 1,000 structural integrity reserve studies. So we got a little bit of experience doing this over the last few years. The Structural Integrity Reserve Study never existed until, like I mentioned, the tragedy at Champlain Tower South. And there was a number of task forces and minds that went into, okay, what went wrong, and how do we make sure that this never happens again? And what the task forces, Florida Bar created one, Community Associations Institute created one, which I'm a strong proponent of their group as well. I was part of both of those task forces. And what we found was really a need to ensure that we're funding reserves for structural components. There was really and this is especially in the House of the Florida House of Representatives. The leadership there felt, that the Champlain Tower South had a beautiful lobby and had done a lot with their pool furniture and aesthetic components of the building, while kind of, not ignoring but not addressing some of the known structural issues that they had. And said, this is pressure. I mean, I feel it as a board member. I'm sure many of you as board members feel the pressure to take care of the curb appeal and the aesthetics of the property. Absolutely very important to do so, but it needs to be balanced with the structural components. They said we can't have boards spending money that's needed for structural and safety issues on aesthetic items, and so we had to kind of separate that out. They said that was going to be important and something that they keyed in on. They also Florida was unique in that it allowed a majority of a quorum at a meeting to waive all of the reserves. So essentially, a very small percentage of the ownership could have line item veto power, if you will, on the budget and say, we're not going to fund any of our reserves. And many associations fell into that kind of vicious cycle of continuing to waive reserves, partially funding the reserves, because when you give members an option and they don't have any other obligations than to worry about their own personal situation, they're probably going to waive the reserves. And so that's what many associations did year over year over year. And then as the building ages, a board finds themselves in a nearly impossible situation, which was the case at Champlain Towers, is that they knew they had, 9 million issues, 9 million, and it grew from there, but millions of dollars of repairs that were needed without the ability to get financing, because they didn't have a very good financial situation and a lot of non-owner occupied units. And they didn't have the ability to pass a special assessment. And the special assessment was getting kind of vetoed by the owners as well. That required an owner vote. And so what do you do? I mean, boards really don't have other options if they don't. And this is just a universal truth. If we have repairs that are needed, boards have kind of four options. They can dip into their reserves if they have them. They can special assess. They can try to get financing. Or do nothing. And many associations, if they're get to those limited options, end up doing nothing, deferring projects, even though the boards have the best intentions. They get in those impossible situations. So the legislature said, look, we got to make this a much higher threshold to waive reserves, and now it's a majority of the ownership to waive any reserves, and it essentially removed the ability to waive reserves for non-structural or for structural components initially. There's a few tweaks now in 913 that's giving a little flexibility of that. And then the last reaction, and this is something we are probably going to continue to see. We're seeing legislation all over the United States. This map kind of shows changes since, there's 4 or 5 states that have made significant changes since June of 2021. Several others are considering those changes. New York, Michigan, Illinois, I know all 3 very big condo states that are all considering changes right now. And what happens is, as buildings age, right, and this is again universal, as buildings ages, they require maintenance. And if there is no, we spend a lot of time inspecting buildings and permitting on the construction phase, but then a building gets its certificate of occupancy and boom, for 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, there's no reinspection program. The buildings become dangerous and can become dangerous. So if you go to, I spent a lot of time in Chicago early in my career, and you go there and they have a city ordinance that requires a facade inspection every 4 years. Well, that's because chunks of the buildings were falling and hitting people, and they needed to implement this ordinance. So now you see scaffolding all over the place when a building's getting its facade inspection. Same thing in New York. But there isn't, and Miami-Dade and Broward actually had a reinspection program, but there wasn't a statewide program. And so we're going to see a trend, I think, continue countrywide to have some sort of reinspection, some sort of safety inspection program. New Jersey had recently put in one about the structural safety of buildings, because and it probably will not just be limited to condos, I think, at some point, but now that's kind of what started, because that's where these issues, at least in Florida, have surfaced. But in Chicago, for example, is all types of buildings, commercial, everything that has a re-inspection program, just to ensure the safety of those people that might be in the building, living in the building, guests in the building, or just simply walking by the building.
Yeah, and Matt, the value also here is understanding Florida is a lovely state to come and retire. So we have to understand that the laws that they put in place, it's for the benefit of the community. So that's very important. We serve the community, but it's again, it's the bones, it's the heart. You have to take care of it. So I really think it really crossed a necessity, right? Now
Yep.
you have to do it. And it's just an eye opener for all of us.
Correct. And a lot of other states are looking at the legislation that was passed in Florida to model their legislation after what's worked, what hasn't, what have they had to tweak. You know, they're talking to our legislative alliance about the language that we're recommending and kind of the where to draw the lines, because there is in any sweeping legislation like we saw in 2022 with Senate Bill 4D was some gaps, some confusion, some areas that make it harder to interpret. So we've had now a few versions, and initially it was each residential building that is 3 stories or higher. In this year in 913, they added the word habitable stories. So habitable means that the spaces for living, eating, cooking, or sleeping. So your bedrooms, your kitchens, your living rooms, your dining rooms would be considered habitable. But we saw many buildings that have like parking on the first floor and then 2 stories of residential above. The initial iterations of this law required them to get a structural integrity reserve study and a milestone, by the way. But now the law will not require those buildings to have that. They also added that it was smaller buildings, single family, 2-family, 3-family dwellings were not required to have a structural integrity reserve study. They added 4-family dwellings this year to SERS that are not required to have a structural integrity reserve study. Otherwise, it's all residential condominiums, 3 stories or more, the 3 habitable stories or more in height. The SERS really only applies to the condominium ownership of the building. So if you have mixed-use building with a hotel, and a condo, or a commercial condominium and a residential condominium, it really only pertains to the residential condominium portion. And then any other component of the building that's maintained by the party of the other association, including the homeowners. So if the homeowners are going to maintain the windows and doors on their units because that's what their declaration is required, then those are not applied in the SERS. So this is the list kind of that they came up with. That was kind of the initial focus as well. We've had a list. There was always a statute that said we had to have reserves for roofing, painting, paving, and anything else over $10,000 for condominiums. And so when I was asked after the collapse, what should the list be? I said, well, that list covers everything. I mean, that covers your concrete restoration, that covers your plumbing and electrical systems. Like that, if we followed that, if everyone followed that, we wouldn't need a change to the law. But they felt that because some of these things are out of sight and out of mind, I think because some of the items are such long-lived that people don't think about them as costing more than $10,000, or they've replaced, for the example of like plumbing or electrical, you can replace little pieces of that are less than $10,000. They were leaving them off the schedule. So they said, no, we have to have a more comprehensive list. The list went through 2 iterations, but here's where it stands today. The roof must be considered as a structural item. The structure, including load-bearing walls and primary structural systems, primary structural members, fireproofing, fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing, exterior painting, and windows and exterior doors.
And I think, Matt, just is for our audience, that this is the top line of all those systems. But in waterproofing and exterior painting, there could be many, many, many pieces that make up that line item. So again, I just want to make sure and reiterate, as we go through our reports, we look at useful lives, we look at costs and systems, there are many systems that make up the entire category.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And my next slide too is the last kind of bullet on that paragraph 2, which can be a lot more things. Any other item that has deferred maintenance expense or replacement cost that exceeds $25,000, and the failure to address it would negatively affect the items in the subparagraphs above. So things like the seawall, if a seawall is close to the structure of the building and it's not maintained and it fails, and that's going to impact the structure, the structural integrity of the building, the seawall would be included. The swimming pool, if it's above the parking garage and inherent with the structure, it could be included. So there's a few things. Stairs and railings, I think a lot of cases would be included in structural integrity, because again, if you're not maintaining your railings, you're going to have post pockets that are trapping moisture and damaging the structure. So that great point, Alex. And even yeah, waterproofing. There might be painting, that might be on balconies, that might be the sandwich membrane between your plaza deck and the garage below. So there's just quite an extensive group of components that would be in there. We studied all the CERS, like I said, over 1,000 structural integrity reserve studies that we did, and we actually found about 2/3 of the expenses for an association on average, and of course each community is different, but about 2/3 on average related to structural components.
And I think it's important, Matt, just for our audience again to understand that there are a lot of things that people don't even realize are there, like split slab waterproofing on an amenity deck. The cost to just get down to it to replace it is staggering, and you never see it, and you may never have even known it was there. So again, it's so important to understand what the components are in the report. One thing I also just wanted to point out on this slide, Matt, is the $25,000 number is now changed.
Yep.
Yeah. Initially it was 10,000, and now it's 25,000. And then what they put in the requirement, and this is for all condos, so structural and non-structural. They actually changed this in both places. The division is going to be required to look at a new number each year. So next year, if inflation happens and we got 20, it might be 26,000 next year and 27,000 next year. It's kind of tough building these one size fits all, but their thought process there, from my understanding, is that the $10,000 number that had been there since 1984. So in 1984, $10,000 was a lot of money. In fact, it was the equivalent of $25,000 today. So they just said, let's bring that to current day. I will say I'm getting a lot of questions on that. And should we remove the items, that are 15,000, 20,000 from our schedule? I say, it comes down to the association. And even when it was 10,000, we had a lot of associations that were smaller that said, look, we want to reserve for anything over 5,000 because our general maintenance budget in each year is not going to maybe suffice to capture, that $9,000 pump or that $8,000 lanai, that screen. That's going to be something that we want to have in the reserves. But it allows you, and especially if you have a larger association, allows you to increase and remove some of those smaller items from the reserve, both either structural or non-structural. Some of the big things, though, too, that we want to remember is that there's a lot of components. Like I said, about 2/3 are structural, but that leaves a third, which is a significant amount of money, and sometimes more in some associations, that are not structural. Yet they still might fall under the required reserves that with the statute that says roofing, painting, paving, and anything else over $25,000. So just a partial list of those here. Just wanted to list them out to get people thinking. All of your elevator equipment, your HVAC equipment, none of that is part of the structural integrity reserve study. So we saw when we did a lot of the study, we always try to encourage our associations, and we got most of them to agree to look at both sides, do a structural study, but then look at what's needed on what we might call the non-structural side or the general side of reserves. And we saw a lot of associations do that. Some providers out there were saying, well, let's just look at the structural because that's all that's required. And then they're kind of left wondering on this other side. But so if you may not have in your structural integrity reserve, so you may not have anywhere, information about the needs, the useful lives and costs of some of the items on this list. Drainage systems, carports, buildings less than 3 habitable stories, right? So like I said, our community has 2-story and 3-story buildings. Well, technically the 2-story buildings are not required to have CERS. So we've got roofs on those 2-story buildings that might be now by these definitions considered non-structural. So that's something to consider. Our community happened to decide, look, we want all the roofs to be in the structural. So we put all the roofs in there. And I don't think that's an issue. I don't know. We'll find out if that's an issue or not, but the people that lived in the 2-story buildings said, wait, I want to make sure that our reserves are all put together with the roofs for the rest of the building. So that's a little bit of a nuance that we have to identify, but the list gets pretty long, and again, some of it's aesthetic stuff, furniture and art, certainly that's not the most important thing to a building, but I absolutely believe in associations spending money on those things to maintain competitive as we have new developments, new luxury high rises being built every day. It is inherent on older buildings to stay modern, to keep their spas competitive and to keep their components that they do have in good working order, and that requires significant funds. So
and I think this goes to the critical question of replace versus repair. HVAC, you have operating, and then you have a maintenance contract, and folks, we maintain it, but that's not in the replace part. So not knowing sort of where you are, what sort of dollars you could expose to, what could happen, what is the useful life of that equipment that you don't necessarily have to fund for. If you're not thinking about it, this is where real issues with special assessment happen in their immediate needs, because you may have already found a funding vehicle to be on the other side of the ledger, but now you're stuck with having a cash call. So it's really important to put these together and to think about it as you develop your budget.
Right. And a common question, I guess, do we have to have separate bank accounts for them? I don't think it's required. It's not explicitly required to have separate bank accounts, but most of the CPAs that I talked to are saying it'd be a best practice to have one bank account for your structural, one bank account for your general, because those funds do have to, I guess the funds cannot go from structural to non-structural. They have to be, really be spent on that. So keeping that fund and keeping the interest on that fund all within one group, one pool, if you will, is a best practice.
Yeah. And Matt, you mentioned, I'm sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Nope, no, go ahead.
No, you mentioned again the CPA. This is critical because it's not just your reserve study. It's you have to have all your players look at the foundation and develop that strategic financial plan. Get your CPA involved, get your attorney involved, obviously your reserve study, your management team, and the board. So that way you come to the membership with great information.
Great point. So who has to do this? The structural integrity. This again is reviewed. This didn't change much. You still have to have either a engineer, architect, reserve specialist, or professional reserve analyst conduct your structural integrity reserve study. They did add this year in 913 a requirement to disclose intent to bid on any related services. So we saw just a big surge of new reserve study companies coming into the industry. Of course, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but some of them were using the reserve study to promote other portions of their business and get business. For example, a waterproofing contractor that would maybe hire a reserve specialist to do a reserve study and say, "Oh, you need waterproofing. Here's a bid for the waterproofing." And that might be okay, but again, it's really important to disclose that. And so now there's actually a requirement that professionals that are bidding on the SERS or the milestone must disclose their intent to bid on related services. The deadline was moved. So the initial deadline to have the structural integrity reserve study done was December 31st of 2024. It got extended 1 year, so now it can go until 2025, which what do we got? Four plus months to go. Most reserve study providers book out 3 months in advance, so you're really running up on a short term to get that structural integrity reserve study done if you haven't already. And then it's required every 10 years. There is a couple of options for delaying if the milestone is due on or before December 31st of 2026. So 1 more year. If you have a milestone due, say in June of 2026, you can actually defer the SERS to coordinate with the milestone. And then this year with 913, they said that you can delay the SERS for no more than 2 consecutive budget years immediately following the milestone inspection. So I think this would have been nice to put in initially, that we would have had the milestone first, because again, milestone, I guess we haven't talked much about the milestone, and we don't have time to today, but the milestone is looking for immediate structural repairs that are needed. And so once you do that and address those repairs, the legislature, and that is kind of a movement with 913, was to allow a little bit of time to address those repairs first, and then start saving for the next repair or the items that might have 5, 10, 15 more years of life on them. So that's now in the statute. If you've done your milestone, you can delay your SERS for 2 years following the milestone. Reporting requirements are big. So this was not in the initial version. It got added, I think, in 1021, which was 2.0, I guess, Condo 2.0 they call it. But requirement, and then it got added to again in 913 here. But they really want to make sure that the boards are being transparent with this. So within 45 days, the association must distribute a copy of the study, the structural integrity reserve study, to each owner, or a notice that it's available electronically. They also must provide the division with a statement indicating that the study was completed and provided to each owner. This year, the underlined portion of the upper right-hand corner there, the officer or director must also sign an affidavit acknowledging receipt of the completed SIRS. So I'm getting the question, you did our SIRS 2 years ago. Do we have to sign the affidavit? I think it's a good idea. You'll just note that, yeah, we received the SIRS back in 2024 or whenever it was. And there's an affidavit that you have on file that says it's been done.
I think, Matt, also we had a question, and just to be clear for board members, 45 days after getting your completed report, okay, you could be in a draft and it could take time and you might be going through it with Matt asking and answering questions. Once it's finalized, you've got to distribute it to your stakeholders. You also have to register it with the state. It is critical that people don't miss on this. It must be registered. So again, I think that for the question, yes, you got to share it. No, you don't have to give them a copy. Electronics, okay. They can make their own copy, but you've got to share this with your stakeholders.
Yep.
One of the key things that we've done also with many of our clients, Alex and Matt, is we do town halls where we bring Matt in and explain the reserve study, the whole entire reserve study. So that, again, it provides a value to our membership to understand why now you have to reserve XYZ. So it helps during your budget, but it really helps for the owners to understand the actual report, because one thing is the posting and you have to do it. I think it's what we try to do our efforts is communicating with our stakeholders and doing those town halls. It goes a long way, and in AKAM that has really set us apart in that sense, because we really care about our owners, and then we show them, again, this is the study. So it has helped the membership.
Yeah, and it should be a selling tool, right? When a community has gone through this process and has done their due diligence and has a plan for the next time they replace it, that's going to give everybody a peace of mind in the whole community. And that'll actually, I think, and of course, we're in a bit of a market correction right now for various factors with condo resales. But once we get through this and once we see associations that are very well maintained and have this paperwork in order and have a plan in place, that's going to give buyers a peace of mind as well, and it's going to set those communities apart that have done it. One point on the form that the state has, it says, you can upload your reserve study to the state's website. That's not a required field, and it's not part of the statute. They put it on there to see if, I don't know why, but it's an optional thing. So you don't have to put the whole report up to the state. Of course, if they wanted to come and inspect it, they could ask for a copy of it. They have a right to do so, but you don't have to put that on the form, just simply that you've done it. And then the division was charged with developing a website. So it can be found, the easiest way I think to find it, either Google, SIRS reporting database. The DBPR, Department of Business and Professional Regulations, maintains this database. You can also find it at a new website they created, along with a lot of other great information, condos.myfloridalicense.com. If you go to that website, you can search their database, their reporting database, and see if your building's on there or not. So take a look, and if you haven't reported it, the form is linked there as well, and you can go ahead and report that you did it. And that way, this is available to the public. So again, potential buyers, mortgage companies, insurance companies you're able to look and say, okay, this building's on track or not. So let's talk about incorporating this in the budget. So there's a few kind of modifications here that happened in 2019. Initially the law was, and it still is, if the association is required to have a SIRS, the annual budget shall reflect the findings and recommendations of the most recent SIRS. So I get a lot of associations in the past have gotten the reserve study and said, okay, that's nice, but we're going to reserve for this amount, and we think the roof's actually going to be half of that. So we'll adjust these numbers. We think the paint's going to last longer. They'll take our report, they'll adjust it, and that's what they'll budget for. That's going to cause problems, I think, going forward. So because of that first sentence, they're required to follow the most recent structural integrity reserve study. So if you don't agree with something in your structural integrity reserve study, you need to reach out to the firm that did the structural integrity reserve study and have them make the change. And some, we're always working with, there's a lot of different ways to go about construction projects. And so there are certainly different options, tweaks that can be made, adjustments on timing, phasing of projects, different approaches to whatever project it might be. but have that be reflected in your CERS so that what you budget matches up to the most recent CERS. This year, House Bill 913, there was an addition that said for budgets adopted on or before December 31st, 2028, so a little over 3 more years, the reserve funds contributions can be paused or reduced for the purposes of funding repairs recommended by the milestone inspection. So again, they said, let's take care of the milestone work first. You can pause reserve funding for the purpose of the milestone inspection, but only for that purpose and for 2 consecutive budget years. That does require a vote of the owners to make that pause.
So Matt, let's unpack this just for a second, because this has been probably one of the biggest questions we see. We're going to pause because the statute says we can pause now. So just to be clear, if you have completed a milestone, and I think it's no further back than July of 2026, but if you've completed a milestone and you are going to be doing repairs, funding those repairs to fix the issues identified in the milestone, you can pause for up to 2 consecutive years with a vote funding structural CERS. And again, I think the piece of this, and to Maureen's point, this is where the team really matters. I don't think we have great clarity on what they mean by when the project's going to start. So if I think the project's going to start Q3 of 2026, can I pause now?
Yep. And that's
right?
Yep.
So Matt, I think this is where each association, based on the study, based on what the milestone showed, where you're at, where your council really believes, these are things that associations must focus on now. And I can tell you, for the associations we're working with, I've seen just as many answers from no, pause means hammer on the building, people working on the building. Some attorneys have said signed contract with work to come. That's, good faith. And some said, oh, you're bidding it and you'll do it. That's it. So again, you're going to need to work with someone on that.
Yeah, that's right. You want someone to guide you through that. It says for the purpose of funding the repair. So yeah, I think you're going to have to, I think that's going to indicate at least there has to be some outlay of cash that's going to have to be made to those repairs for that to qualify or trigger the ability to pause. But I'd caution associations about this as well, because if you have a roof that's, let's say the roof has 3 years left on its life, it probably didn't show up in the milestone inspection. It's probably not something that is needed immediately, right? But you have other milestone work, and you're maybe working on some milestone work. But if you got $1 million roof in year 3 and you got no money for it, do you really want to pause until year 3 to start funding that roof? There may be maybe a need to consider that, and maybe even that's when you start looking at the next bullet on this that allows associations to incorporate regular assessments, special assessments, loans, or lines of credit to fund the reserves as part of the funding plan. Those certainly are options we've seen. Those are really the 4 options or 3 options I think that I mentioned before. The 4th one was the do nothing. The line of credit is new, so we've always kind of been able to special assess our loans. Now we're seeing a line of credit. A line of credit is it at some point likely converts to a loan when you go to do the draws on the line of credit. And I think banks are still working out exactly how they're going to structure that. How long can you do a line of credit? I think it works. It works for some. I've seen a couple of banks that have worked something out, but it's generally when there's a near-term project like that roof in 3 years. Okay, so we're not going to fund the roof, but we're going to take the line of credit out, and in year 3, we're going to start drawing on that line of credit. Bank might agree to that. Maybe it's only 2 years that they'll go out. It depends, but it's not really a long-term fix from what I've seen for associations. I equate it to, I got to save for my kids, college, and they're coming up here in 5-10 years. Did I get a line of credit today to borrow for their college in 5 or 10 years? Probably not. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's much better to start setting aside funds, actually, because at some point those funds are going to be due. So it's a good bridge. I think it's good, well intentioned by the lawmakers to do that, but it's probably not going to be a fix all or a silver bullet for associations that are just way behind on funding, because the more that you don't borrow money to put it into your 401k, the more that you borrow, and likely you're gonna add interest payments. It's going to actually be more expensive for an association in the long run. So it's a bridge. It's there. It's available. But again, yeah, work with your team to figure out what that might look like, and we can run. That's a nice thing about the reserve study. We can run different scenarios and say, okay, here's what that would look like if you borrowed for it. You might see that the costs in 5 years or whenever you start drawing on that line become much higher down the road, and that might not be as attractive to, again, a potential buyer or a bank that's writing a mortgage in that association.
Matt, one thing I just wanted to make sure we're aligned with, and please correct me if you feel differently, but we had a couple of questions about the vote of how you could vote for these assessment loans, lines of credit. And as I read the statute, what I took from it is a majority vote of the total voting interest is required. Right. So it's not quorum majority. So it's not that small minority that you used to be able to punt on. It is vote of the total voting interest. That's
exactly the language. Yep, exactly. Great. So you got a 100 unit building, you need 51 votes to approve, 51 units to approve that.
Right. So again, I think also to everybody, please, this is where your documents, your attorney, and look, this statute is we're at 35 days old. So there's no case law on this one yet. So again, work with the team to get through it. But again, we think it's majority voting interest.
Yep, absolutely. And the last point on this slide, I'll move on to any pause. The pause would trigger the need to update the CERS before you start funding. And there is also a statement that says any variation in the funding that's not in your prior CERS would triggers the need for an updated CERS. So generally it's 10 years, but that assumes you're following it. So if you go off track and aren't following it, or you decide to get a line of credit that's not part of your CERS that you did in 2024 because that wasn't allowed, now you're going to trigger the need for an updated CERS.
Best practices also, Matt, is again, if you have a lot of moving pieces, it's intelligent and wise to go ahead and update your CERS.
Yeah.
Again, it just makes sense when you're putting your budget together because you have a different starting balance. So you just want to make sure everything is aligned. So.
Absolutely. Now, our industry standard is like 3 years for an update. That would be a best practice. And some associations are doing them more frequently. When you have changes or you do start to get off track, or we see a spike in inflation, or hopefully we see some cost reductions in places, it makes sense to update. It's very inexpensive to do updates of your reserve studies once you've done the initial one. And you can usually do an update for all reserve studies with or without a site visit. Without a site visit, it's going to be less expensive still. So it's not a big investment to keep your plan on track once you have one. And this is slide, with the language that you mentioned, Alex, is a majority of the total voting interest of the association required to waive funds. And then there's disclaimers too, that is, the waiver of funds that's got to be on the proxy that may result in unit or liability for unanticipated special assessments. We get a lot of questions on pooled reserves, and so I'll move on to that unless there's any other questions we want to cover.
No, let's keep rolling.
No, you've been covering as you're talking it through.
Perfect. So pooled reserves are allowed. It's always kind of been allowed. It got codified now. It was in the administrative code for years, but now it's also in 718 that they can be pooled. But it explicitly says here that paragraph G can only be pooled with paragraph G items. Structural can only be pooled with structural items. And it also expanded on the requirement that a vote of the members is not required to change the accounting method to pooling or straight line component reserve. So I think, again, that's always kind of been the practice, that changing the method hasn't required a vote. The vote was always related to taking funds that were earmarked for a specific project and using it for another purpose. So maybe moving things from straight line into a pooled required a vote. And that, I think, still does. I don't think this language goes far enough to allow that, but I've heard different interpretations on that as well. So just make sure you have a good legal counsel that will defend you in the court of law when a claim comes. I can tell you my opinion. Alex and Maureen can tell you theirs, but this is not legal advice that would pertain, and we wouldn't simply be able to. We can testify, but we're not going to be the ones that are going to defend you in a lawsuit if it ends up coming that way for something like this. So best practice there to get a vote, I think, and to avoid any potential claims.
Matt, just to spend just a second on this, for people's benefit, pooled versus straight line. So when you have SERS, you have your components. In many people's financials today, there was roof, paving, painting. They were straight line. They were segregated per the topic, the component. Now you can have one number, which is a pool, where anything can be funded that is in that pool. Just quickly hit on what you see as the benefits of being pooled versus straight line.
Sure. So pooled allows more flexibility. So the board doesn't have to go flexibility for the board, which again, that could be I have that here as maybe a drawback, but some people are concerned that the board's going to go spend all of their roofing money on new planters or new landscaping. That I think concern is mitigated now by this law to some extent. So I think boards, in my experience, overwhelming majority trying to make the best use of the funds and trying to put the funds where they should go. So the pooled reserves allow them the flexibility to do so. But the main reason that people switch to pooled reserves is just lower funding. Instead of keeping 12 different buckets of money full at all times, they can spend all of the money on the big projects as they come and not need to maintain such high reserve balances for the items that may have more remaining useful life on them. Depending on the association, I've seen it where it's double or triple to fund the component reserves versus pooled reserves. I've also seen where it's very close. So it's not a one size fits all. We always run it both ways for associations that are trying to decide which one works best. But a vast majority, when they see, okay, well, we can still fund our reserves, we can still meet all of our requirements, but we can save hundreds of dollars a month for our owners, it's usually a pretty easy decision to go that route.
Right. Thank you.
It can be less conservative, though, and that's why I have to touch really closely on this. But there's three kind of strategies for reserves. Pooled reserves specifically can incorporate any one of three of these. Component reserves are always more conservative. They're really on the full funding. They try to reach full funding balance. But baseline funding and threshold funding are other method strategies, goals, if you will, that the National Reserve Study Standards allow and define. The new statute says that you must at least have baseline funding, which means that the reserve contributions can go down, can't go any further than zero. I'm sorry, the reserve balance can't go any further than zero based on the inflows and outflows of the cash for the reserve, which is it's actually almost exactly how it was written in the Florida Administrative Code, but they're now using some of the CAI language here. So baseline funding is allowed. Full funding means you've got essentially the whole depreciated amount of that item in the bank at one time. So full funding really focuses on the fully funded balance versus of each item versus maintaining a reserve cash flow above zero. Most associations fall kind of in the middle, threshold funding, which simply means we're going to do a cash flow that doesn't go below zero. And I've got a couple of really quick slides that we can buzz through. I know we're running up. I don't want to go too long, but baseline funding. So this is an example. This is just a real quick case study of a community. It's a pretty small community. They only needed $49,000 a year to fund their reserves, and that resulted in an annual contribution of $132. And this was based on a baseline goal. So you can see the blue lines here are the expenses over the next 30 years. The green bars are income inflows. These are the contributions or the funding requirements. And then the purple line that kind of looks like a mountain range and goes down to zero here at the end, that's your balances. So as long as the balance doesn't go below zero, doesn't go negative, this meets baseline funding requirements. And again, in this particular association, that resulted in $49,000 a year. We actually recommended a threshold funding here, which kept the reserves from going anywhere below 100,000 after they started to build it up. So they always had a $100,000 cushion. You can see that purple line here never drops below 100,000. It required about $3,000 more per year to fund that from the association, but it was a pretty small amount to give that board a bit of a factor of safety. I'm going to go right to this next slide, which is the same association to do full funding, which means maintaining reserves at or above 100% funded, required a much larger amount, $79,000 in reserve funding. So, and you can kind of see the balance. In this case, we added a orange line. Sorry, that's the percent funded which is the scale over here on the right. And you can see that kind of grows over time and reaches 100% at the end of the study, end of the 30-year window. But you have a balance now that kind of goes up to $1 million, and you're never spending more than a couple $100,000 a year. So this, in my opinion, oftentimes is kind of overly conservative for most associations, but it is like the most conservative funding goal. And a lot of SIRs that we saw, because people felt, oh, we have to have fully funded reserves, used this model, and they tried to get communities to go to 100% of the fully funded balance, which is, maybe overly conservative compared to what's actually required. And so now the language specifically says, like I said, that the schedule can be based on a baseline funding plan that provides reserve funding goal in which reserve funding for each year is sufficient to maintain the reserve cash balance above zero. And so the study can recommend other types of schedules, but the minimum amount is baseline that has to be done. So just there's some flexibility in there with how people address that.
I think, Matt, and again, in the interest of time for folks, when we look at this graph, and I think what's really critical here is where you look at where your expenditures are, right? When you think you're going to spend money. So if you're an association that has really got a lot of deferred maintenance and stuff to do, and you're going to spend a lot of money over a short amount of time, looking between the different methodologies is really important to the health of your association, because you're going to spend money. And I think, Matt, what's really interesting between the first and the second example of baseline funding, and as an owner, I was going to spend $132 an annual contribution. But then I went to threshold, and I really look at the same thing, the same funding horizons, the same type of projects. And for, a few dollars more, I actually have a cushion. I have a rainy day fund. And this, again, is critical, I think, as we go to our budget season today, and for our boards to think about this idea of, no rainy day money or some rainy day money. That's going to have all sorts of important positive impacts, not only to, I think, your membership feelings, to your community value, to the longevity of the asset value. All sorts of things play into that. And you can see these are small numbers. So again, it's so critical to really dig in a bit to what the study's telling you.
Yep. You got to find out what fits for your association. And it's not just rainy day. I mean, we have costs fluctuate. When we try to do our best to estimate what the cost of a roof is going to be. Well, the chance of there being some change orders or something going up or down, it certainly exists. And so that's why we always are trying to encourage boards to leave yourself a little bit of a cushion. For a few dollars more, it makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, we have other associates say, look, we just got to get past the legal requirements now. Next year or 2 years from now, we can look at building that cushion in, and that's all legal. It's all okay. This one where it goes all the way up to 213. That's probably on the more conservative side, but I have associations that want to hit that as a goal too. So got to talk within your community. That's kind of becomes a business decision. Well, and the last, I think I got 2 more slides or something, but just talking about keeping the reserve current. You mentioned this earlier, Maureen, just doing, not doing this, once every 10 years, but doing it a little bit more frequently to we're maintaining the property, avoiding surprises. When the board's doing their job and taking care of repairs, it's so much easier on the managers and the boards themselves about issues where, a unit sells and we've got a leak and we've got to take care of these items. We end up spending a lot of bad money, or money on repairs, Band-Aid fixes that can actually increase the total cost of ownership. So if you have the whole purpose of this is to look at long-term, but to maintain the property with the lowest, cost of ownership that's there, and deferring projects. Just like when I go to the dentist, waiting on things is not going to make it better. So take care of them as they come up.
More costly,
property, exactly, more costly and more painful. So keeping on top of the repairs as they come, keeping your fund in your reserve in a good, healthy position is going to make for a more harmonious community. Make for again something that has good property appeal, property values maintained high. Look, everybody's looking at this now. There's a microscope on our condo associations on where we are. not only from buyers, but their mortgage companies, insurance companies, or others, investors that are looking at condominiums, and they want to see, that we have a well-run business, because that is ultimately what this is, and we got to budget accordingly. So that's my last slide. We got about a few minutes left for questions. I saw a ton of great questions coming in. Do you want to shift gears, or anything else you want to add before we do that?
No, I want to hit some of the questions, but here's the big one that I wanted to address for a bunch of people, Matt. So based on this legislative change, last year you were supposed to have done your CERS, but you were able to not fund for 2025 if you got your budget approved and your vote before December 31 of 2024. And all of a sudden now, in the new statute, as of July 1, the statute says if you did not fund your 2025 budget in accordance with your CERS study, you need to get an updated CERS study. Is that accurate?
So I think it could be, but I don't think the language is really important here. So I got my 191-page copy of the bill here, and I want to read to everyone the exact language here. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to interpret this, but I do have here's the requirement. It does say, so it says, it doesn't say that here's what it exactly says. The association must obtain an updated structural integrity reserve study before adopting any budget in which the reserve funding from regular assessments, special assessments, lines of credit, or loans do not align with the funding plan from the most recent version of the structural integrity reserve study. So my interpretation of that is, say we did the study in 2024 and you waive 2025. There's some funding amount in 2026, which is the budget we're adopting, listed in that 2024 study. I think as long as you're following that, I personally don't think you need to get an updated study, as long as you're following what the study said you needed to fund. And again, that's a fund, not the balance, but the fund. So as long as the budget aligns with the structural integrity reserve study, I think that you're okay. I think if you wanted to fund a different amount, then that's when that's what triggered the need for the update. But there is a question there, and I think I can see it interpreted both ways. I know I've heard different interpretations too, but the balance. So there's a thinking too. I get this question a lot. Well, you projected, say we started with zero, and we're going to put $100,000 in this year, and you projected that we'd end with $100,000 this year. Well, we put in, we had a little bit extra, so we put in 120,000 this year. So does that mean we can reduce it next year to 80,000 because our balance is a little bit higher? I don't think so. Same thing could be said if you're going to spend, because the balance is going to vary. As good as any reserve study is, you're never going to hit that projected year-end balance exactly. You're going to earn a little bit more at interest. You're going to maybe a project gets moved out a year, so the balance is going to be higher this year, but the liability still exists. The project's still there the next year. I think the key is to continue to fund, and what the reserve study recommendation is funding recommendations. Continue to fund according to that reserve study. And if you vary from that, you require the update. But I don't know. I don't think it explicitly says you need an update if your last year or a prior year budget or expense changed from what actual was or what it was projected to be.
Which is great, and again, still ask. And I think this is talking to your reserve specialist and your attorney, how you're doing it. I think the other big question that's come up for multiple people, Matt, is I did my reserve study in 2024, but I also did work in my property. So some of those high dollar value things that had less useful life were addressed or are being addressed and will be completed. Should you update your reserve study knowing that you have completed or are in the process of completing big projects?
Yeah, and again, I think it's not a bad thing to do it, but I don't think it's a requirement, because most likely, hopefully, your reserve study said, yeah, we're going to spend $1 million on that restoration in this year, and that was part of the plan that was baked in. It's when the plan changes dramatically. Like, you know, if there's a big project that wasn't anticipated, and the same goes to the prior question, if you waive the reserves and you don't make up that funding somewhere, you're going to fall short. So you're going to kind of be in this position where, yeah, you know, we're not going to have enough, even though we said we're fully funded, we're not going to have enough because the plan or the circumstances have changed. So I think always a best practice when you're veering from the plan, absolutely a best practice. But I just want to be clear, I don't think it's a requirement to get an update in that same situation, Alex. I think it's absolutely a good idea because, again, you're going to want to have a current set of information to share with your board. But I don't know that at least I'm not reading into the law where it says you have to update anytime you spend more or fund less in prior years. Now going forward, anything that you want to budget that varies from it would trigger the need for an update.
Totally agree. I think this goes to just my thinking is this goes to continuity across boards that change in budget seasons as they're using their reserve study as their guide for funding. So when there are big changes that could benefit an association, right? If you could see something that could benefit the cost that you're looking at, you know, I think you really need to leverage your specialist to do that. You know, we always, you know, associations, you know, we sort of love to leave our attorney and our accountants and everybody on islands because we don't want to talk to them. We don't want to pay for them unless we need to. But I think now that working together to build a solid budget and plan that's going to go for a decade, that when there are substantive changes, you likely want to really make sure your plan makes sense because volunteer boards are just that, volunteers, and they're not expert in this. We are just at time. Maureen, anything parting shot that I missed?
Just bring your winning team, I think. Boards, you know, we have great questions. Always bring your experts. That's your winning team. So take your CPA, your attorney, your management team, obviously your reserves expert, especially with funding. Just bring them all together. That's my recommendation.
Thank you. Matt, parting shot?
Yeah, I put this slide back up again. If you have questions, I know we didn't get to all of them. I'll try to respond to them. But if you have other questions, here's our emails. If you want to just take a quick shot of these, I'm happy to send the slides out to people and keep this conversation going because there is a lot here. And just, you know, let it reach out. We'll do our best to answer everything. An hour goes by really fast, and there's so much to cover. But I want to thank AKAM and you, Alex and Maureen, for inviting me on today. And look forward to continuing the discussion with folks and best of luck out there.
Absolutely. And thank you to everyone. And again, you're more than welcome to reach out to myself and Maureen at any time with questions. And we really do want to help. And we are very sensitive to that. This is an emotional topic. This is difficult. This is substantive dollars for lots of people that necessarily weren't planning for it. So we need to help you work through it. So with that, thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.